Well, welcome everyone to a revolution of interdependence. I am super excited today to be here with Daniel Sih from Down Under. And I'll tell you a little bit about Daniel. He has 15 years experience working in senior leadership, strategic consulting roles across Australia. He's a trainer, he's a coach, he's a speaker. And he's been in a number of leadership roles, including in the physiotherapy world, health management, in ministry. And Daniel's also the author of Spacemaker, which we're going to get into hopefully in the second half of this interview. But I'm super excited to meet with Daniel today and to bring his voice to each of you. So welcome, Daniel. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on your show, Will.
You bet. So we always open with one question because we're all about interdependence, which is, can you tell us the story of a person or a group that was the difference maker for you? You can't imagine having gotten where you got in life without that person or group.
Yeah, look, I mean, there are so many mentors that I've had in my life. It's hard to think of one, but look, I would actually have to say my wife, Kylie, who really is an amazing person. We are so different in so many ways. I don't know if people are familiar with Clifton Strengths or Gallup Strength Finder, but
Sure.
My top 5 are her bottom 5 and vice versa.
No.
So we're kind of completely opposite personalities.
Right.
But, you know, we talk about interdependence, and isn't marriage like that? You rub off on each other, you grate each other terribly, but I'm focused and she's adaptive and flexible. I'm strategic and she's empathetic. And, she brings out the parts in me that need to be brought out to be a healthy human, and hopefully vice versa. So I can't imagine being where I am without her in my life for those kind of 20 years.
I love that story. That's so great. And so you've had a wealth of experience, and I know some of it is around living in community. I know you've had a number of different community experiences. I'd love to hear that part of your journey.
Yeah, so look, it probably began when I was 19 years old, and I ended up going to Vanuatu as part of a leadership development program with my local church community. And it was a really good experience. We weren't going there to fix things or help people. We were going there to learn about culture and learn what it might look like to see our lives through the lens of another culture. And so I think it was well designed. And you wouldn't be allowed to do this nowadays, because there was myself and another 19-year-old kind of child, really. We were sent off into the jungle of this island called Malakula. So we were the only white fella on the mountain. There were no other adults. They didn't speak English. It was Bislamar. So we had to learn the language before we went. No electricity, no communications. I wrote a letter and I received the letter back 3 weeks later, so that was our supervision. But it was an incredible experience living in this jungle village where we hunted for our own food and we lived in a grass tent. It was just this life that was so different. And I remember being quite struck by how beautiful the communal life was, and what it was like to actually live in a village, which I'd never experienced with my, Western kind of secular way of growing up in Australia, which is probably not that different from the States from that worldview perspective. And I remember having a chat with the pastor of the village, and he is the only person who spoke English and went to Australia years ago. And I asked him what he thought of Australia and our culture. And I've always remembered his answer. He said, there were 3 things. He said, one, everyone smokes, which is really funny because I'm like, what? We smoke. And he hadn't been to Australia. He hadn't been anywhere out of the tropics. And so what he meant is when he breathed, condensation came out of his mouth. So everyone smoked. He thought it was weird that people weren't friendly in the streets, so they didn't greet each other, which is probably true. Yeah. And the third thing he said, which always stuck with me, he said that people put little fences around their houses, and they must be very scared or very protective of their stuff. And it's so different in Vanuatu. People just shared life, and they were, like you said, interdependent. And I walked away with this really deep conviction that I wanted to live a life without fences in the way that I used to live, and that I wanted to have a more permeable life and more interdependent life. And so that led us, eventually I got married, not at 19, but in my mid-20s. I lived in share housing. We intentionally tried to put ourselves in situations where our life was more open, a life without fences. And and eventually, when I moved to Tasmania, I met a family, another couple who had similar convictions to me, and we actually bought land and built two houses without fences, and designed our space so that neighbours would play on our in our backyard and jump on our trampoline, and where we would open our houses up and create this intentional, I suppose, community. And that's, that's part of my journey to learning what it looks like to live in a slightly different way in this kind of hyper individualized culture that we all surround ourselves in.
Yeah, yeah, that's a beautiful story. What did you, well, so let's start with this experience with the tribe. What did you learn from there in terms of sort of what were you able to take from there? Because I sometimes wonder, like, there's these sort of idealized settings, not that they're idealized to the people there, but then when you leave there and you go, like, what changed in your spirit? Like, what did you take away from that?
Yeah, and look, I certainly don't want to idealize the village as well. They had their
Right,
problems. I mean, I was
right,
training as a physiotherapy student at the time, and I met a lady who said she was in pain. She'd lost lots of weight, and I just, with my limited medical knowledge, I knew she had cancer. But what do you do? So
right,
we weighed her at the local airport, which was like an hour and a half walk away, and it's just a grass strip with like one scales on, one set of scales on it for the
right,
village, for the island, and then we weighed her a few weeks later, and yeah, she'd lost lots of weight, but basically that was a death sentence, and there was a whole lot of superstitious stuff. So I suppose I'm not idealizing the culture, but at the same time I walked away realizing, wow, they are happy people,
yeah.
and there's great joy in simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
I learned to slow down and enjoy silence and solitude, which I hadn't ever experienced in a deep way. And I learned to, I think it led me to be a more reflective person. I learned to journal. I learned to just start to pay attention to my own thoughts rather than just the thoughts around me.
Right.
And it really impacted my faith as a Christian. It impacted the way I saw church and the way I understood what we would call Christendom, which is the sense that we do church with particular cultural forms. And I started to see that through because the way in which the Vanuatu people did kind of church, some of it was kind of weird, and I'm like, that doesn't fit their culture at all. So that had been imported in, and then I'm
Right.
like, what have we imported in? So there were a lot of changes and shifts that happened in my thinking through that formative kind of few month process.
That's fascinating. And you liked it enough that you tried community again. So I'd love to hear, because you and I shared in conversation before the podcast started, we both have had some experience with some intentional thinkers and some people who have really focused on what it means to live out your story, your faith story in a community. You did that very particularly. You mentioned it just briefly, but I'd love to hear more about that story, both the good and the sorrowful.
Yeah. So look, we met Michael and Julia when we moved to Tasmania, and we wanted
Right.
to connect with this group that were doing life differently around pubs and clubs, again, through our faith. But look, they were just an amazing couple, and they had one child, and we had a child as well, very young. Our child, I think, was about 1 year old or less. And we found that we had both as different families had been living with other families in share housing, and that was fine when we didn't have kids. But as much as I like to have this ideology that my life is less individualized, I'm still,
Right.
a wealthy, educated, middle class kind of Australian, and I need my own space. And
Right.
it didn't work to raise children with flatmates and without our own space. And so we wanted to find a way to have a life without fences, or a life that was more communal, and yet recognize that I'm not a villager in Vanuatu, and I never grew up that way, and it's just not
Right.
possible for me to really live that way. Does that make sense?
Mhm. It does. It does. Yeah.
Yeah. So to sustain this, we bought land, we built two houses. Michael was an architect, so that was tremendously helpful.
Nice. Yeah.
And we created these two simple houses together, surrounded by neighbours who are actually in housing department units, so they're quite all unemployed, and there's a lot of challenges socially in that area. But then the rest of the street are really wealthy, because I only live 12, 13-minute bicycle ride from the city. and they're doctors and lawyers and politicians. So it's this weird ecosystem around my street where you have very wealthy and very poor people all together. And we thought, what an amazing place to be able to share life together and see if we can somehow be a village in and around our street by opening up our lives. And that has created some beautiful stories. We've also had some tremendously difficult times,
Right.
and but we have been living alongside of each other for 13 years, and very much see each other as extended family. Our community has, grown where others have moved into units and flats near us to be part of our communal life. We've also had losses. Our neighbor died of a heart attack suddenly, the person I built land with. So that's transformed our community. And so we're in a new phase. But I suppose through that, we have learned the beauty and the power of shared life, and the challenges, but I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.
Yeah. And do you find yourself developing a new set of rituals? What does community life look like for you and for your
Yeah, so
community?
it's changed over the years. What's fascinating is we had our honeymoon period, like you
Yeah.
do with a marriage.
Right.
The first few years was just a buzz because we finally made this project happen and we got it off the ground. We got some chickens and built a garden together. So it's kind of everyone was happy. And then it probably by about year 5, there was quite a lot of tension, and we all had more kids. So now we had, I think, 6 kids on the block between us rather than 2. So that's a hard time in life generally.
Right.
But we also started to realize that just like a couple that's not doing well in marriage, you can live in the same house but not actually share life together.
Good.
And
Yeah.
we found that geography doesn't create a community, actually. The shared dreams got us so far, but they're Dutch. I'm half Chinese. My wife's an Australian, dinky dye. I don't know what you'd call it.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
and our
Yeah.
cultures were different. While we had similar faith beliefs, our expression of what that looked like was different. And we just started to really have tension, particularly around some interpersonal conflict with some difficult neighbors who I didn't feel safe around, and they wanted to invite into our houses on a daily basis.
Right.
And so that was hard to know, how do you navigate inviting a neighbor in where you don't feel that they're safe with your children, and yet the people we do community with feel very convicted to invite them into our lives. And we weren't right or wrong. We just were missing each other.
Yeah.
And so to answer your question, what we what we discovered was that creating predictable patterns became a real game changer for us.
Mm.
And by that, the thing that saved us, we would have left and it wouldn't have worked, but we had a weekly meal every Wednesday night.
There you
It
go.
wasn't a dinner party, it was a rough and ready meal. And I write about this in my book, that we needed to, whether we wanted to be together or not, there was a commitment to eat together and to share life. And the kids would do plays and they would run around making noise. And we were an extended family because we submitted our calendar and our schedules to the rhythms of shared life together.
Right.
And look, there were some beautiful stories that happened through that time, dreams that people had in our community that unlocked our selfishness and helped us to realize we needed to all change in order to make our way through this. So that there's like a spiritual story that helps us, and the ability to actually navigate conflict in community. We needed the people in our church to come and actually do conflict mediation with us. It got to that point. But
Right.
walking through that, just like, again, like a marriage, when
Yeah.
if you walk through hard times and then end up in that new space, we actually got there, and we kept eating week after week after week, and something happened in our hearts, and our character changed, and there came a point where, like, we absolutely love each other, and we've never been closer since. And that led to this beautiful, fruitful period in our community life where just everyone wanted to connect with us because we'd created this pattern and rhythm in this extended family, and people could feel it and see it. And it was authentic because we'd gone through the trials of conflict and suffering together, and got to the other side. And so, yeah, another couple moved in, like, to the units next door, and they entered our dinner circuit. And then the neighbors, and then another set of neighbors wanted to join in. Different friends joined in, and we ended up with what we call big dinner, it was like 25, sometimes more
Right.
people every Wednesday. And we needed to buy a shared fridge. And so we created a rhythm on a Monday once a month
Right.
called Big Cook, where we
Right.
all got together as a community and we would cook together and drink wine and then freeze the meals for the
Right.
next month. We ended up having fire pit, which we light a fire in our backyards because we wanted to find a space where wealthier and less wealthy neighbors could be a community with different beliefs and backgrounds, and middle-class houses don't work for that around a table. But lighting a fire in the backyard and eating spuds, potatoes.
Right.
We say, don't bring your wine, don't bring your drugs, and we'll just all be a community.
Right.
That worked really well. So that became a rhythm. And then these rhythms ended up multiplying beyond our houses. And we realized that it's not the geography of living together that actually creates a community. It's the commitment to each other, the commitment to regular patterns, and the spiritual faith-based element behind that. And that multiplied to multiple communities where people just happen to live close enough to be in a short drive from each other, but they could still create this kind of big dinner pattern and create life and hope in their neighborhoods. And so that's been part of our story, if that's
I
useful.
love that. No, that's beautiful. And I've had some taste of that. So I really resonate with that. And I'm struck by, I'm struck by the fact that people really want connection. And for you, it was eating together, living near each other, developing some basic rhythms, things that it was doing things we already do, just figuring out how to do it together. And maybe staying long enough. Like I heard in your story, like part of the journey was, no, we're going to stay. It's hard right now, but we're going to stay. And you stayed and got to the other side of that, where you began to see the fruit from that. Man, that's beautiful.
I definitely think that's right. It's the commitment to each other.
Yeah.
And the willingness to be vulnerable and honest and walk through conflict if it happens. Hopefully it won't, but if you do life closely enough with people, there tends to be some tension points. It's the predictable patterns, and for us it was eating a weekly meal. We actually, after the conflict period where we struggled with each other, we ended up praying once on a Thursday morning. We pray with each other, and that's been there ever since. And I must admit, we often don't pray very much. We kind of share our week, and then we pray at the end, going, "Whoops, we've got 5 minutes." But that's a really good touch point for us.
Yeah.
And this kind of way of the fire pit is a way of us serving in a broader sense. So it's like we exist outside of ourselves, not just for ourselves, and that's also been really important.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of in aspect of community, the out aspect of being there for neighbors, and the out kind of spiritual aspect, and those three patterns have really transformed our community. And I've seen those patterns being important as this idea is multiplied in other communities.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You did have to deal with the death of a friend. I'd love to have you reflect on that. Not to relive the pain, but just I'd love to hear what that meant to do that in community.
Yeah, and it's been tremendously painful, but also quite a testament, I think, to life shared together. And I spoke. So Michael and Julia are the people I built with, and Mick was healthy. He's the architect, but he just fell down and collapsed in August last year and died of a heart attack. We tried to resuscitate him. Then the paramedics tried, but he didn't make it. And so I'm now the only man on the block, and we have two families and kids who are navigating life for our kids without their uncle, and obviously for the neighbors' kids without their dad, which is a tremendously hard experience. But what I suppose we've navigated building land together, and we've done life together, but actually doing loss together is part of the journey of connectedness, I think. And I asked Julia, I said, I actually said, I'm speaking on a podcast, this is a few weeks ago, about sustainable living. And I wondered if she had any perspectives on what it's like to live in community. And she said, you know what, that if she just said she couldn't imagine going through this type of grief alone. And it's the things that are unexpected that she used to feel safe with Michael around, and she doesn't feel as safe at night now that it's her and the girls. And yet, because our family is next door, and we are only not even a phone call away, we're just a shout away,
Yeah, yeah,
then and we do come in, when there's challenges or they need immediate help, we are there. And just practical stuff like helping with the garden, helping with feeding chickens, but more
yeah,
so we still eat together twice a week, and I think those kind of things have, well, look, she said it's just been tremendously useful. And more so the patterns that we used to have, because we built our life around shared patterns and shared life, those patterns have also sustained her. And I can see what she means. It's really, what we've noticed is there are some friends who just don't know what to do, because how do you bring up death? And
right,
they might love our neighbor, but it's really hard to know, do I ask them how they're going? Because they're clearly not doing well. We just don't know how to deal with death in Western society.
right.
And yet, because the patterns exist, we can be irreverent on a Thursday morning before we pray, because we always have
Right.
been. And we can enjoy a messy meal on a Wednesday night, because that's what we've always done. And so life continues in and through our shared grief. And I can't imagine myself going through this without leaning on another person and leaning on others, and having that sense that life is actually shared. It's not,
Mhm.
yeah, that the joy is in the life that's collective, the
Yeah,
togetherness of eating and praying and learning and serving together. That's the joy. And we just happen to be in a tremendously painful season, but we're doing it together. And I think that's beautiful. I'm really thankful for that.
yeah, yeah. And I know you speak against sort of the traditional ideas of success and all that. And I know you've talked a lot about patterns and rhythms. I think that's a good segue into the whole idea of space maker and sort of
Mm.
um, digital Sabbath. And there's a lot of concepts there. I'd love to hear you unpack. We're short on, I mean, we got about 10 minutes left, but I'd love to hear you unpack the space maker idea, because I think that is so important. In my coaching work, so many people are just looking for calm in the midst of this crazy digital storm that they've created around themselves. So talk to us about the idea of space makers, and how that what I'd love to hear too is how your work and community informed that space maker idea and what you put together there.
Yeah. So look, my business is called Space Makers, and we started that a decade ago. And the heartbeat behind that is even a recognition 10 years ago, I mean, let alone now, that
Yeah,
space is a rare commodity, that the thing that we're going to long for in life as leaders, as entrepreneurs, as business people, is not more technology or more information. It's actually more time uh, to think and rest and connect with people in meaningful ways. And yet, even 10 years ago, I kind of could foresee that without intentional patterns and investment and skills, everyday people would lose the space to actually be human. And we would just become this kind of, busy mechanism
right.
that runs to a standstill. And I knew I was hungry for space in my life, and I knew that others would be as well. Now, fast forward 10 years, and I mean, my book is about how to make space in the digital age. And I spent 7 years writing it, and then I published it in the year of COVID, with some
Right.
updates based on what was happening with the pandemic. But post COVID, oh my goodness, like our whole life has become digital, and we're losing aspects of our humanity because we're always online. And actually, the spaces that we used to have, even the pauses where we would be at the supermarket and wait in line, or when we're on the bus or the train, where we would just think our own thoughts and reflect on our own values, or pay attention to the moment, we're losing all that because we just pull out our phone and we're automatically back in the online world. And so the book is definitely not an anti-technology book. I wrote it for people like myself who work almost constantly online.
Yeah,
And I value the online world. I live in this little city and get to coach people in New York. That
right.
none of that was possible before the iPhone and before digital tech really kind of
Right.
became normative. So I'm very grateful for technology, but the book goes through a journey where I teach people the relationship between technology and productivity, that we need tech to be productive, But if you use too much technology, you end up in digital overuse, and you
Right.
lose your health and happiness and relationships and productivity.
Right.
And then I help people change their paradigm, their thinking around what tech is and why we relate so deeply to it.
Yeah.
We move people to the principles, which are like, what do you want to orientate your life with in the moments when you're not online? And
Right.
they're things like silence and solitude, and deep relationships, rest in a way that's structured and meaningful. The kind of human pursuits that we're losing without these unplugging habits. And then the final part of the book is just super practical, because I'm a productivity consultant. So it's like,
Right.
how do you unplug each day, each week, each year, in and around constant overuse, so
Right.
that you, from a research perspective and an experience perspective, you actually experience this deep and rich life in and around your tools. And that's the passion that I have, to help people think differently. And there's a interconnectedness component, because there's just so much that relates to technology that
Right.
disconnects us, that shapes
Right.
our worldview, and that makes us hyper individualized consumerists, and unable to see the world from a spiritual perspective because of the material eyes we see the world through. So if you don't rethink technology, you'll never be able to truly live an interconnected life.
What do you think people are most afraid of when, with the challenges of rethinking technology, with the challenges of finding balance? What do you experience as the thing people fear the most, with approaching technology that way?
Yeah. What do they fear the most? It's a good question. I can only go existential. I still think
Yeah.
we fear death, and we don't, and we're not, and we're not willing to admit it. And so it
Right.
leads to us anxiously needing to prove ourselves, having to pull ourselves up at the bootstraps,
Yeah.
us having to define ourselves by what we achieve and our successes or our relationships.
Right.
And I don't know, that's probably a little bit too big and broad to really help your audience. But I mean, I think at a very deep level, we are not able to confront the fact that, as Oliver Berkman says in his great book, that we have 4,000 weeks. And
Right.
until we can confront that we have 4,000 weeks, which means we are finite, we will never achieve everything. We'll never get
Right.
all of our to-dos done. And
Right.
therefore, we need to make very intentional decisions about the life we live, and what we spend our time on and what we choose not to.
Yeah.
And of course, that involves unplugging from technology rather than constantly being online. Well,
Right.
then it'll be very, very hard to live your own life rather than living by culture's script. I don't know. That's a very big answer, but hopefully
No,
there's
that's a
something
great,
in that.
that's a great answer. And I think people who listen to this podcast will definitely resonate with that. I love you quote Parker Palmer, who I love. Like, you and I need to compare bookshelves, because I'm sure we'd have a big overlap. But Palmer talks about this idea of the gravitas that comes in the second half of life, and how we can find a certain okayness. And I'm wondering if you could reflect either on your own journey or even on people you've worked with as they've started to move into this better relationship with digital technology, and with just the digital world and the digital story, kind of the story that it tries to tell us. If you feel that people can experience more of that okayness, like if they can really, whether it's Palmer or Jung or Richard Rohr talks about the second half of life, like do you see people being able to move into that more contented, more okay life once they begin to embody these practices?
Yeah. Look, I just see our culture as one that is leading and living from the outside in.
Yeah.
We look shiny on the outside, and we're working, we're doing the right things, and we're creating the right habits. But there is this deep, anxious fear that drives us, this lack of inner peace, this
Right.
lack of what I would call deep rest
Right.
at a soul level, and this incredible yearning for space, which is why I have a business built around making space. And so I suppose the premise really of what I write about is that space has always been hard. It's always been hard to be quiet and to examine the inner life, because when we do, we have to face our own demons, our own fears. And in order to face and then by facing our own fears and our own worries, and examining the data in our life, and for me, giving it to God and getting revelation back again, there's this sense where you end up knowing who you are and knowing your moral convictions and knowing the calling that you have on your life, so that that can shape your life, so you live from the inside out, from a place of peace and rest rather than exhaustion and anxiety. But that's always been the case. But nowadays we have this extra layer where we actually have no space. I mean, there was this fascinating research study by the University of Virginia where Americans were given 6 to 15 minutes alone by themselves without any distraction, and they chose to give themselves painful electric shocks rather than sit and ideate without a screen. And so we have trained ourselves to so habitually fill our lives with information and distraction that we don't even have the ability to wrestle with silence and to move through that inner journey that leads to the mature spiritual life and the second mountain, as we kind of might allude to. And so we need to unplug as a habit first, and then create those spaces where we are both creating connection with community, which changes us, and connection with ourselves, which is silence and solitude. And in order to then have that deep sense of knowing who we are and how to live. And it's not impossible, and it starts by making space. But my passion is to take people on that journey so that they can actually live a deeply healthy, inside out life that is shaped by their soul and their spirit rather than by the script around them. I hope that makes sense.
It does. It does. And I think that's a beautiful thought to end on. I'm excited to have people hear you and hear what you've shared. How can they find you? What's the best way to connect with you on the internet or in the
look,
world?
I'd love people to reach out. I'm on spacemakers.com.au. You can find my email address. I've got free information about how to create a digital Sabbath, if those kind of ideas are useful. We also run training all around the world. I have a trainer in Canada, but I also train for the US time zone in productivity stuff, like how to get your inbox to zero, but also stuff like how to actually make space and build digital resilience in your life. We have a bunch of half-day online courses. So I'd love people to look at what I do and connect. And of course, I'd love you to buy my book. It's everywhere. It won. It's not a religious book. It won the Australian Business Book of the Year award last year for personal development. So that you'll find it everywhere. But if you want to make a bit more space, I'd love you to just open the book and go through that journey from your mind to your heart to your habits, and see where it leads you.
Awesome. Daniel Sih, thank you so much. This was really, really great.
No, thanks so much for having me on the show. I appreciate it, Will.
All right. Cheers.